Good morning, everybody. Welcome to In Tune with Joon. We're on the 16th episode. Today, we're going to be discussing, is violence the answer? And other than that clickbaity title, we're going to be sort of diving into violence and its role in the U.S. We're going to be seeing where it's necessary, where it's not necessary. We're going to be discussing whether peaceful societies are, utopic, or is it something we should strive for? Are they actually oppressed? We're going to be looking at those types of ideas. Today, we have a lot of familiar faces, but I'd like to start by introducing our new face here. Oscar, welcome to the podcast, dude.
Thank you very much, Kia. Good to be on here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And let's go through the familiar faces that we see here, starting with Emma. Emma, how you doing?
Beautiful day in the neighborhood, Kia.
Yeah, you might have caught her on our meme review. Actually, Evan and Daria and Zara were on there as well. Meme review every Saturday at 2 p.m., by the way. And without further ado, let's introduce Evan himself. How you doing?
Will you be my neighbor, Kia?
Will I be your neighbor? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And moving along the list of recurring faces, our oldest guest, our first guest, Daria. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Good to see you there. And finally, last but not least, we have Zara. How are you doing, Zara?
I'm great. Kia, how about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm still feeling quite wholesome from the memes that you submitted for the meme review for last Saturday. So, this is a pretty heavy topic. And we bring this topic to light because right now there's a discussion in the U.S., protesting against police brutality. And that is obviously a form of violence. Killing is a form of violence. I think that goes without saying. So when we ask, is violence the answer, there's a lot of places that we can start. But I think that we should focus first on defining violence. So I'm gonna do a quick Google search. We're going to put a dictionary definition.
No research.
Huh?
No research.
No research. Now I like to
What is
have
your
at
definition
least
of violence?
Okay.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
without looking at any sort of material, like I would define violence as like a use of force when ideas are not enough to get your message across. Now, let's look at the dictionary definition. It's the use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. World Health Organization defines violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So that's a really wordy definition from the WHO, but I think it touches on a lot of the themes that we wanted to cover today. So that's considered a less conventional definition. I'll put both up. How's that? So we can use these two definitions of violence when we are talking in our discussion. I feel like the first definition is sort of violence on a basic level, and the other definition is the more complex, like using violence as a tool. At least that's how I see it. And I'll sort of define them, one as less conventional. Okay, that should be good enough. Very good. So, on that note, now that we've defined violence, do you guys think that we should start, if we're talking about the U.S., with colonization? Is that a good place to start?
Is this focusing on violence in the US or like violence at large, or like is there a period of time that we're focusing on?
All great questions.
I think
Go ahead,
we
Dave.
should go with violence at large first, just in general. I think our definitions might vary from that one. I mean, mine certainly does from the ones you gave.
Well, let's hear it, Daria.
Well, I mean, I think violence against others or yourself is just part of a general, it's under the umbrella of like a larger meaning of violence where I think like, I guess I wouldn't really be able to package it neatly in a sentence, but like when an animal eats another to like subsist, like that's an act of violence. Or when planets, or when like a sun explodes, right? And like a supernova, like that for me is like violence. So like any kind of force of nature, but that doesn't harm anybody or harm anything. Like for me, that's like violence. I think creation is an act of violence as well, because you're sometimes you're dismantling or taking other things apart, for example, or you're using elements from something else. And putting things to like, because it's like an act of force to put things together as well. So, and anything that uses force to create or destroy for me is like violence.
Okay. On the topic of supernovas, on the topic of animals eating other animals, I'm not disagreeing with you that these are appropriate definitions of violence, but do you think they'll be pertinent to our discussion today?
I think so, but not
really? Okay.
directly. I think like they'll be subtly pertinent, because what I would like to get to today is how demonized violence is in the first place, and the reasons why. Like that could be like a subtopic.
Okay. All right.
And that would relate to the protests. Why looters were
Gotcha.
why looters were brought to the spotlight. They try to do that above the protesters, etc. Things like that.
Okay. Sure. I'll include that at the bottom then. And I'm sure that.
I wanted
Go ahead,
to know.
Evan.
What about like the threat of violence? Because like force in your definition was very vague, but like, would you consider armed robbery, for example, that where you don't actually hit the guy, but you have a gun or something, and saying, give me the money?
Is that violence?
Oh,
Is that a form of violence?
Is threat of violence violence? That's a good question.
Yeah, you're infringing on their agency to make their own decisions. So I'd say it's potentially violent.
Yeah, I would like categorize that as like an ideological force, right? Like the idea of being shot.
The symbolism of being able to be killed and manipulated by a firearm.
Yeah,
thinking about like, does this also extend then to sort of like emotional or verbal abuse, like the
sure.
violence? Right, so we're sort of encompassing like force, even as it is sort of like non-physical, but just like a mental force or a mental sort of like attack or whatever, verbal attack on someone. So
totally.
like,
I think
so we're doing a broad definition.
Yeah, because I really think like it's important that we have this broad foundation, or else we're going to overlook a lot of things. That's what I want to stress. Or else our conversation is just going to be every single other conversation about man-on-man violence, human-on-human violence.
Yeah, I thought that we would branch off to this, but we're setting the foundation right off the bat. That's great. So
I hope that Daria tells us more about supernova violence.
Stop star on star crime.
I'm sorry to plug right away, but that's my band name. So if you guys want to subscribe on it,
get out of here.
Great name.
Oh my god,
could be supernova violence. Yeah.
Could be dank. But okay, so I've added supernovae hunting, psychological like manipulation, abuse, emotional. We're going to include those in our definition of violence. Just to be clear, is everyone cool with that?
Yeah.
All right. So then I actually didn't want to start, let's say, from colonization, but I would rather like to discuss this more in the abstract and sort of focus as we continue our conversation once we see where everyone's at and how we're thinking. So I'm going to pick on you, Dario. Dario, how do you want to start us off?
I had a clear idea. But then we started talking about definition of violence.
And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Yes. What would be a good starting point? That's a good question.
Freeform podcast, by the way.
Well, do we want to talk about current events first, and then we can go back from there?
Okay.
All right. Sure.
I could do that.
It's
Let's
easy
do
to
that.
relate to the present. All right. Zara, want to talk to us about it? I'm calling on you like the teacher.
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on, and I think I've said this in a previous podcast, but what I felt was a really great point of view from Trevor Noah about, you know, the violence that's going on in the protests. Not, they are separate things, but like, you know, that have stemmed from some of the protests. Is that, you know, there's been an agreement in society of, you know, the government taking care of its citizens, and, you know, making sure they have rights, and you know, that they have their basic needs met, and some people are not getting that from the government, and therefore that side of the agreement is not being
yeah, like you're saying the social
respected.
contract has been breached, right?
Exactly. So that means that, you know, there is a societal agreement that we shouldn't be violent towards other citizens or towards police or the government or whatever. So that's kind of why people are just angry, because, you know, the contract has already been broken. So that's why people aren't feel that they're being heard or respected. So out of that frustration, sometimes violence can come from that. And that's from both sides as well, obviously. So, yeah.
Okay, so in your view, Zara, violence as a response to, let's say, breaching this social contract that we have with our government, with, let's say, the police that's meant to protect us, that's an appropriate response.
It's something that I do not personally agree with,
Okay.
but I am not here to tell other people that they cannot express themselves in that way. Because I think if I were in that position, because I'm definitely not, I would be, I mean, I'm already upset, but, you know, the violence that's going on from, you know, police and the government is not against me in particular. So, you know, if I was in that situation, I can't judge what they're doing because I'm not in that situation.
Okay, got you. All right. Emma, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys already know this, but there's this documentary called Black Power Mixtape.
Oh, that's a great documentary.
Really good documentary.
I've actually never met anybody else who watched it. That's so cool.
It's a really good documentary, and like it features the one, the only Angela Davis, being just like very wise, as she generally is. But she sort of talks at one point about violence, and specifically how, you know, in uprisings and in sort of like revolutionary movements, violence is sort of what's focused on as like this point of either like diminishing the movement or just like that becomes the focus instead of on like the goals, or like, you know, I mean, these movements are happening for a reason, right? And like there are other like anarchist arguments for like why violence should happen even without a goal in mind, but whatever. But like Angela Davis talked about this specifically, and no, I mean, like she just says, you know, she's not condoning violence, but she's saying like it's really difficult to imagine that there's a version where an uprising can function without violence, that like these sorts of like outrage can come without some form of violence, be it like, you know, just violence against property, which I think is like a pretty fucking medium, like tiny form of violence.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about that. And also, I mean, like, it's really difficult. Like, I don't know, I was just reminded a lot. I mean, this is sort of like an aside, but in about like the Arab Spring and the Tunisian Revolution started because his vegetable cart was taken and he set himself on fire. And it's like, I don't know. I think it's sort of a part. I mean, I would like to say that there's a way to have peaceful rising or peaceful revolution that would like actually work, but it's hard to imagine what, like, when you're in such a position of desperation, it's like, what do you do? And as was like, I'm not in a position also to like say what you should do, but yeah, anyway.
Evan, so
but I think we have to distinguish two forms of violence as like an outburst or a reaction to a situation, which I think Emma and Zara are talking about. I think it's almost like irrelevant to talk about like justifying or condemning violence when it's just like an event in response to other events, because no one right now is saying like, well, maybe some like extreme anarchists are like, oh, we got to burn cop cars just as a tactic, but most people are like, just, you know, protest, whatever, that's the tactic, and then things get violent, mostly from the police, but also from rioters, fine. And that's just a response. But then there's like violence, what Emma was talking about, like revolutionary violence, which I think would go beyond like the guy setting himself on fire, which is again like, I mean, it's a form of protest. Like you know, you have those stories of like the monks setting themselves on fire and all that, but like it's more like, like, do we fight the state, or, you know, like you go in the woods and you have your guerrilla army. That's like revolutionary violence, and that's like more extreme. I mean, there's like it's like a tactical question at that point, but then there's also like, when it's like right now, it's like, can you understand violence just like as an outburst? And it's sort of like, yeah, I don't think justification comes into it anymore.
Well, I think that's why people are unable to ever justify violence, and I think that's a problem, that we're not able, as a society, we're not able to justify violence in any. That's a form of control, and it's because of what you're saying. I don't think we distinguish in our minds between like revolutionary violence and then like murder, for example. Like for us, everything is equated to murder, or like, you know, that's on the slippery slope of when is it okay to, like, how much violence is necessary in what situation, right?
yeah.
But if we had a more feel for it, a more human feel, if we weren't educated since we were like, you know, kids to be so pacified, we'd have a more palpable way of like, you know, setting change into motion, other than constantly teetering between this is murder and then, you know, or like, oh, it's okay if I, you know, break a store or two.
Yeah, I wanted to point out at one point that on a morality basis, violence is like a black and white issue for most people. So the fact that we're weaving in nuance early on is important. And yeah, I think Evan was saying that the justification isn't the key here. And Daria, I think you're also saying that it's an issue that we can't justify some violence. Is that right?
No, as kind of, I was saying more like, I guess I feel like justifying some violences, right, shouldn't be such a controversial issue. These protests, I mean, of course, my opinion, but these protests are one of them, for example. When all that violence, you know, minimal violence went down, I didn't see, like, for example, I think, you know, a lot of people didn't really see an issue with what was going, like the violent means that were going on, because of exactly what Evan was saying. It's a reaction. It was a reaction against, like, you know, years of oppression, you know?
Okay. So overall, we've created two distinct areas where we can see violence. All right. I guess, if we're talking about an issue that's so decisive for so many people, my first question is, how do we move from a place where this is a black and white issue to introducing nuance with people who use this rhetoric, either deliberately or not, against protesters who we seem to agree have a right to protest, and while we don't necessarily condone violence, nor is it our place necessarily to do so, we recognize is a part of protesting?
I could start us off. I have an idea, but I kind of wanted to touch to answer that. Kind of wanted to touch what Zara and Emma were saying, and especially Zara, because when she brought up what Trevor Noah said, I think has a pretty interesting link with the fact that, like, if you look at industrial societies, like, you know, like countries in Europe or, you know, North America, or countries that are industrializing, like Brazil or like India, and this goes for China as well, of course, a very industrial country. These are countries that have a large percentage of their population that is pacified, right? So there are no like conflicts. Like, you're not going to like if you're living in those countries, you're not worried about your, like, you know, say, like, the general populace is not worried about their safety day to day, right? They're not in danger. They're not like, they don't have to like protect their village from like a raid, things like that, right?
Okay.
I mean, of course, there's, you know, there's favelas, there's slums, there are ghettos, of course, right? But overall, there's kind of stability, right? Like, that historically has built up to that moment. And I think that, like, that image I just painted is problematic in itself, you know, because that's the image that we got when we were, you know, growing up. Like, oh, like, imagine if you lived in the United States in like the 18th century, right? You know, like, or you like, learn history, like, man, like those, you know, those pilgrims,
or like
those
the Wild West,
had it rough.
Like the Wild West,
or even not that long ago, like 150 years ago, the Wild West. You know, I think that image of like, oh, back then everything is violent and you're in danger and you're gonna, you know, is very problematic, because it really instills this idea that what we live in now, and now we're talking about the U.S. experience. Now that what we're living in now is really like a privilege. See, it's a privilege in society, and it's an exchange that you have to make. So like, I really like this theory of like, there's like this notion that like the government, there's a monopoly of violence on the government side, they or the state, right? And the state being like a general governing body, say. So like, the state has a monopoly on violence. They're the ones that are allowed to use it. And no vigilante justice, you know, don't take matters into your own hand. There's a bureaucratic procedure that's set into motion for violence as well, right? There's paperwork to fill out, police like eyewitness, but what happened here, you know, there's all this stuff that comes along with it, right? So that, the way that's justified, though, that monopoly on violence, because it's essentially like, we're going to take away your power to change things, like on a concrete basis, you know, but you leave it in our hands. And in exchange, you know, initially, the exchange is, we're going to give you all these securities and comforts that wouldn't be possible or wouldn't be readily available, I'd say. They, like, for example, like, you know, maybe the creation of the transistor would have, you know, revolutionized like electronics. That would have been a lot more difficult if we were living in a warring states period, right?
Okay.
So there is a certain exchange. I'm gonna forfeit my right, or forfeit my ability and limit my capacity, I should rather say, to like change things by the use of force or, you know, violence. And in exchange, you should give me some kind of, you know, in exchange, I get all of the securities and comforts and a lifestyle that is beneficial, like, to me and my citizenry, right? Even if there are some ups and downs, right? So I like to say that these protests, big reactions like this, are a kind of, they're a cry, and they're our only way of crying out that you have breached the contract. You are no longer, you have misunderstood our priorities, right? In this case, for example, that blacks are not like human beings, you know, like, that's a priority. You can't just go, you know, there can't just be an overwhelming use of violence against blacks and, you know, oppression and all that, for example.
Yeah, you said a lot there. I guess one of the questions that I thought a couple of things when you were talking. First of all, it sounded like sort of a talking point for why people support the Second Amendment still, right? Like, oh, well, they're armed, they have military gear. Why can't I arm myself? Why can't I have military gear?
Could be.
And this was, I feel like back in the militia days, like Revolutionary War days. This was like why the Second Amendment was introduced to some extent.
We spoke about this on another podcast. We said that it was the kind of Second Amendment is kind of useless now because the why it was put into place is no longer valid because the government has such an overwhelming advance of technology that fighting against them would be kind of,
Yeah, I agree with that. But I still feel like people who do support the Second Amendment would still use the same justification, don't you think? That they're armed. I think I should have a right to arm myself. That's one thing I thought when you were talking.
Yeah.
Another idea was simply like, well, what would you choose? What would you choose? Would you prefer to be in a society where you just kind of have to put your security, I guess, in a government? Or would you want like a Wild West situation, or like what's your ideal? I guess I'm asking, or what's your compromise between?
Well, I love cowboy movies, but on a serious note, I'd like to get Oscar's input.
Okay.
I mean, I think those are two extremes. What Kia just said, and I think it's very self-evident. I mean, it's like you can put your trust in a government that has good intentions for you, or which I think is foolish, or you can have a completely sort of rugged individualist structure to everything. And I think that both of them eat their own tail. Both of them usurp their ability to deliver what they claim to deliver effectively. I mean, I do think that I don't have any guns. I'm not a right winger, unlike what some people might think. But I do support the idea, the very raw philosophical idea that all governments tend toward tyranny, and and individuals also tend toward tyranny, which is a problem that we haven't addressed. But with the first thing in mind, it's like for someone to be able to be on the dangerous scale, 0, I think isn't right. Now, I think, with regards to policies, I do think we need to address some important things with guns and the ability and rights to defend. But I do see the importance of that fundamental presupposition right there in any functioning society that claims to be democratic in any sense, really, So that's my view on that.
Thanks for sharing, Evan, putting him on the spotlight. I'm going to put you on the spotlight, Evan. You want to touch on this subject?
Yeah, I almost feel like, I guess I have the kind of boring liberal opinion of civilians probably don't need automatic rifles. And then it's like, but I need to. Either. And then it's like, well, if you really want to start a revolution, overthrow the government, it's like, it doesn't matter whether the guns are legal or not. Yeah. You're going to get the guns somehow if you're going to start an uprising, right?
For sure.
Possibly.
But the other thing is America has so many fucking guns, so there's never going to be a disarmed America. There's just too many people who love their guns. It would be nice to change the gun culture and have less mass shootings, obviously, but there's lots of issues with violence in American culture, and that's just one of them.
Yeah, well said. So I guess what I'm still asking myself. I feel like I haven't gotten the full answer because it's not easy to come up with a full answer. But what is the compromise between every man for themselves and the government will protect us? How can you compromise that? And that's what I'm left wondering here.
In general, or let's say
just in general,
let's try to come up with a concrete solution for our epoch, Like, which
Yeah,
one-
sure.
which one?
Either way, yeah. I'm struggling to come up with an answer for either of those, though. You know, like if we look here, I think Evan's right in saying that, you know, disarming American civilians is like an insurmountable task. Now, you know, if it's specifically automatic weapons, I think it's more feasible. But the idea of a compromise, I think, suggests that the average person have some way to defend themselves. And what comes to mind in America is guns, right? So then we're talking about an armed population. And that kind of leads me to, is that not where we are right now? like is that not kind of the compromise here? Because there is violence in the form of mass shootings. So when you were talking about, oh, you're supposed to feel safe, I don't necessarily feel that safe, especially in an era where mass shootings occur so often. So I guess, well, now that I've fleshed it out, I feel like we are in a compromise. I don't think we're in one extreme right now. I think we're in some form of compromise where you have an armed population and an armed government. Go ahead. Yeah.
When you leave your house, when you used to leave your house to go do anything, did you ever, was it on the front of your mind that
So
there might
when I
be
leave
a
my
mass
house,
shooting?
no, not when I leave my
Right,
house.
that's what I mean.
But when I go in
in
big
a-
crowds, I think to myself, you know, like, it's possible. I'm not saying it's probable. I'm not paranoid about it, but I'm conscious of it.
Right.
And that does not make me feel safe. Zara, go ahead.
I think there are better ways to defend yourself, rather than like guns and things like that. I think kind of a way of defending yourself is having like good representation with the people that make decisions that affect your life.
Okay.
I think that's kind of a sort of insurance a little bit, where your point of view and people you identify with are protecting your ideals. And I think it's a very masculine point of view to go straight to violence in terms of defending yourself. And I think there are a lot of like grassroots ways of ensuring that your safety, that you are safe, including things like education. And yeah.
I agree with what you said. We're on the topic, obviously, of violence. That's the only reason that I brought this up. Like when I think violence and defense, I do think of arms. I think of guns. It could be my American way of life. Could be my masculinity. Who knows? But it's definitely a big talking point here, at least. But I guess on the topic of, in an ideal in our world, how would you protect from violence, prevent violence? I think that is a viable solution. If you do have a good relationship with lawmakers, with politicians, I do think that is a form of insurance and protection.
I also think that like people's reactions to certain things can feel like they have been like attacked. Things like when someone kneels during the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever. It almost feels like they've been attacked when they see that, which almost like maybe they feel is like violence against their countries, against their ideals.
You protect their values.
That's what it seems like. I don't know. I guess like it also puts into play like, addressing violence from the person who is violating versus, you know, the person who is on the receiving end of violence. You know, someone who is aggressing might not consider their violence.
So that's I was wondering when we were going to get to this point. It's like violence from the oppressor versus violence from the oppressed, right? So I think this is one of the. I think this is basically the key point in the police brutality argument. That is violence from the oppressors versus violence from the oppressed, and we see that dialogue when media covers protests, and like Daria was saying, I think focuses on looting, let's say, which has nothing to do with the message of the protest or what the protest aims to accomplish. And whereas the violence from the oppressed this time around with police brutality is the oppressor is the key topic, that the subject that needs change. You guys have seen the memes and obviously the coverage that, protests against police brutality responded with police brutality. Doesn't that kind of paint the picture in and of itself? Like, that's when you try to criticize violence from the oppressor, you're just met with more violence. I think that's, go for it.
I do want to jump into that because I want to kind of respond to a lot of things Zara said too.
Sure.
So I think, you're bringing up what I think it's kind of what Zara said too, the good representation, having good representation is a way of, circumventing violence. You have good representation, you're good. You don't need to use it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the problem we've discovered with our country, discovered anew that, that's not really an issue, like good representation for us. They don't care. That's why it's a scandal that we have like people that could walk into a Congress, sit down with a congressman immediately and be like, look, I'll give you like $2 million if you just vote yes on this.
Sure.
That's a scandal. That's like, how is that not corruption? How is there a euphemism for that, right? I think we were talking about this. I don't know, but so for me, that shows like, lawmakers barely care. Like, they say they do. Oh, you got to vote me into office. All that stuff. Fine, okay, but so the reason why they don't care, I would argue, is because just like we see all the time throughout history, is once you get a system set into place, whether it's the Roman Empire or whether it's the Mongols, whatever massive system is in place, they know they can easily, like lawmakers, the politicians easily know that the armies, if the military is on their side, if the overwhelming use of force is on their side, they know that any uprising can be quelled quickly, just
by subjugation, right?
Yeah, by subjugation, right. Totally. Once you have that power, whether it's justified or not, you don't really. The issue is not really, am I pleasing the citizenry? The rhetoric, of course, but the actual what's going on behind closed doors, how the sausage is made. Let's say that they don't. No president sitting down being like, no, the people are not going to like this. I think they're sitting down and they're like, the people are not going to like this. How do we package it and deliver it to them? Because this is what we want to do. This is what we think is better for everyone, right? Hence the point of an electoral system of representation. But that is already an inherent issue. You see, they don't care what we think. There is no good representation anymore. That's done with, because you might find you might find one or two people there. You might have an AOC by here or Bernie Sanders over there, but they don't wield any power, politically speaking. They very compared to the overwhelming consensus of how this country should be run. So, given that they don't care really what we think, it brings up the interesting question: is that when every country is starting out, they do care, because that's a very tentative moment. Like, we just had a revolution, right? 1776 or whatever, just had a revolution. We can't go doing everything we think is right? The citizens still have to feel like what they just fought for, what is being erected, is still to their best interest. If only we could keep that vibe going, that would be fantastic.
I see Emma off of mute here, so I want to let her speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I just think, like, I mean, to Zara's original point, I mean, I see what you're saying, Daria, about, like, the current political situation, but I think representation could work if we had a more robust vision of democracy. And by that, I don't just mean, like, a better voting system. Yeah, so I mean, I think the point is, you know, we should think about education, too. It's like, if we sort of remedy a lot of the pillars of what like democracy should be, then I think, you know, if we had a robust educational system for everyone, if we had a sense that corporations weren't, you know, like paying off representatives, like if we had sort of more robust laws in place, make a more democratic society, then I think, yes, I think representation could be like profoundly powerful. And I don't think that we're like I don't think that's impossible. I think it's like, especially sort of, I don't know, I have a lot of faith in younger generations. Like, I mean, there's so many movements right now of like young Gen Zers who are like trying to save the environment and stuff, and like I don't know, like I think I see what you're saying, but I guess I have less of a sort of pessimistic like view that it's impossible for representation to matter at some point, you know.
Yeah.
I guess I could be a little more impatient than you are, for example. Because I'll be like, I don't want another. I would be like, I don't want another 200 years.
Dario is already thinking like a boomer.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
No, I mean, you know, but, how much? My question for you guys is, how much more bullshit? What's the time frame? How much more bullshit are you willing to deal with?
Let me hold off. I liked your question. Let me hold off because I feel like Evan, you wanted to say something before we moved on, right?
Well, I just got coffee, so I kind of missed it.
Just kidding. Okay, because he went off mute. It was just totally based off of you going off mute. But right before we move on, Daria, because I like your question, I want you to repeat it. So please write it down or remember it. I wanted to. You mentioned the military as a form of
can I say
control.
one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Because Daria, as I heard the question, was saying, well, how much are you willing to like tolerate as an individual? But I think it's not up to us as individuals. It's like you can be as pissed off as you want, and you can, you know, go read Howard Zinn, Chomsky, whoever you want, all day long. But if you know, there isn't any movement of people, then it doesn't matter. So the real question is, how do you build any kind of movement to bring about the kind of structural change you want to see? And that's a really pain in the ass of a question. No one's figured
the structural change you want to see in the world.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to put that on a live, laugh, love sign and hang it on my door. But what I wanted to touch on before we continue on that question is Daria was invoking the military as the main source of, you know, perpetuating power and not necessarily representing the people. But what Emma touched on and what you touched on as well, and I think is a more powerful force, is like capitalism, is I think greed as a form of control of power, with people running multiple election cycles, which I don't get why representatives are able to stay in as long as they do. But anyway, if you have the same people who are on the same payroll and they don't have to really educate themselves, they don't really have to worry about their well-being, and they're able to grow their own wealth. I mean, it's easy to let like the capitalist machine take over, I think, and that's another form of powerful control, I think, that can corrupt our government. But you can go ahead and repeat your question one more time, Daria, and we can start tackling that.
Yeah, it's good to repeat it because I think, Evan, I'd say you misunderstood. I don't want to. For me, it's not individualistic. It'd be missing the point if I made it like about like the individual, right? For me, it's more like I like to think of it as like, my question is like, how would a group of individuals brought together, sharing a common, problematic, how would they tackle that together, right? Because it doesn't matter. It seems like, for example, for like the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the protests, it doesn't matter if you're an intellectual or a guy off the street. Everybody's together out there.
I was about to say that, actually. So
that's what I like. I agree with Evan. I don't like people in their corners. I don't like intelligentsia in their corner reading and be like, well, this is better. I don't like people on the street. burning shit for no reason. You know, it's like, well, let's get together. You know, organize it. You know, let's burn this. You know, with this kind of philosophy, maybe. But
Open
so
discussion.
Yeah.
open discussion,
Like we're doing right now.
That's democracy in the purest, most axiomatic sense. I mean, if you want democracy,
and in the
you
most
have to address that.
unrealistic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, people.
People. Yeah. No, but yeah, Oscar, you said it exactly. Most pure axiomatic sense. So I guess my question is, this was really for Emma, I guess, but of course, for everyone. So how much, given the structural change that, let's put a strong effort, a renewed effort in structural change. I want to ask everybody, how much longer, what is the timeline? Like in your imagination, what's the time frame where your limit is, where you would just keep going, but the police brutality would stay the same, or, hypothetically speaking, you keep going for that structural change, but you see that really what you're doing is putting dents in it, and that you look ahead of, like, oh my God, it's been 200 years before, like viable change.
You're a bit robo Daria mode right now, but I think we got the gist of your question. I wanted to try and give my take on it based off of something Emma said earlier. It's like we have dismantled, or not dismantled, but a lot of the pillars of democracy in our country have like eroded. We have a poor educational system. Voting is a mess, just to name two. But so I think when you say time frame, I don't have an answer to that. But what I can say is, I think earlier you asked, when is enough, sort of, right?
Right.
When have we seen enough to warrant a change? I think actually we have seen enough to warrant a change. I just think that we need to educate enough people about it. I think there's enough evidence. Sorry, go ahead.
No, my question is, because that's kind of like Zara. I guess you're kind of saying what Zara said. But I'm saying one is your time frame to start using violence. When is your limit pushed? That's my question.
Like personally or like,
personally, I'd say, I guess. like,
Yeah, that's a really hard question.
Because that's what everybody fights with day to day. Is now the time? It's now the time.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I don't know how to answer that right now. Let me think about that.
I mean, I think you'll know when it's the time, because there will be people, in some kind of party or organization in the streets, and you can say to yourself, do I want to join that group or not? And if you join that group and they're like, all right, Daria, here's a gun, we're taking the White House or whatever, I think you'll know.
I feel like that's really...
It's not like in the abstract, like it sounds like such a hard question, but like when it comes down to it, it's just like, oh, here are the political actors in this moment. Do I agree with them or not?
I don't know, because then how did they get started? Because the genesis, there was a seed. There had to be enough people that said enough is enough right now. Now's the time for violence. So like that would.
No, I don't think violence comes first. I think organizations comes first, and then they asked, well, do we want to, have a violent action here and now?
So when would you guys
any group you want? They didn't start off saying, all right, we're going to get together for the purpose of killing somebody. They got together for like, we want to advance, whatever it is, and then at some point they considered violence.
That's true. That's how the Russian Revolution happened, right? They didn't start just like killing immediately.
Also, if we want to resort to violence, like if we're ready to resort to violence, like what other ways besides physical violence can we,
violence toward the economy? What does that mean?
Yeah, totally. So breaking a business like physical violence? Do you mean that as well, or just mean against your other humans?
Well, I mean, also if we talk about like, I still would consider that like physical violence, because it's like physical.
Well, I have my answer then.
Because then I would be talking about like, where you choose to put your money, and if you
Exactly.
Decide not to buy from certain companies. I think that's already. I think again we need to everyone needs to expand their horizons on what violence is, and that I think right now everyone's eyes are set on physical violence, but I don't think that's the most effective use of violence. And so
I don't know. Amazon's growing.
Well, let me ask you guys a question.
I think it's better to burn down a warehouse than to
I
let
have a
it
question.
keep growing,
I have a question based off of what Zara said. So we saw that it was, the old Donald Trump's birthday yesterday, and we saw all birthdays matter go trend on Twitter. Can we consider that a form of protest and sort of like psychological violence towards the president?
How is it violence against the president?
I know, right?
Isn't that people who wish him a happy birthday? We're like, yeah, go Donald.
No. People. So the hashtag all birthdays matter was people wishing Obama happy birthday, even though it wasn't his birthday. Like it's sort of like a petty way to take a jab
comedy as a form of violence.
Yeah. So that was what.
President during Ferguson. So I mean, if you're down with Black Lives Matter, Obama.
That's not the point. I don't disagree with you, but the point is that
if you're using, right.
I'm not using that example. I'm bringing it up.
Not you, but like the people who are using that hashtag.
Sure, I agree with you, but just the idea of getting this thing trending to point out a hypocritical statement that a president made, right? Is that enough? Like, what do we consider like other forms of violence? Like, is this meaningless in the grand scheme of things? Is it effective?
That sounds pretty meaningless.
Yeah, pretty meaningless.
I think there's a lot of sort of there's vitriol coming from Trump supporters and there's vitriol coming from sort of far left angry activist types or just people who a lot of my friends are far left and a few of my friends are right wing, and I see it on both sides, but it's like there's all this sort of trivial abrasive commentary about things where I think I'm a big believer in sort of like directing one's attention to things that matter, and that sounds so naive and self-evident, but it's like those things are actually regressive. I think they're reactionary, and they're reactionary to something that's worthy of evoking a reaction, but the power that you have to change things is often lies between the atrocity that occurred and your reaction to it is what I think. So I think it's petty. I think I don't disagree with the people, but I think that I think that they are in a way descending to a level of ad hominem attacks and straw manning, and I mean not in that itself, but I think that they encourage that type of rhetoric and that sort of discussion, which doesn't get anyone anywhere, and I think it divides.
So you're saying it's not productive?
More, I think it's anti-productive. I think it's resentment, which there's a reason for. I don't support Trump, and I think he's absurd. I think he's a buffoon. But it's like I think that we need to be stronger as well, not we, but I need to be stronger, and that people who want to do something that is difficult and do it with effectiveness need to look at the way in which they carry that out.
That's a fair point. Emma?
I agree with Oscar, and I also think it sets a bad precedent when someone like Nancy Pelosi calls Trump a doo-doo head and like calls him fat and thinks that's an effective way of
weakness.
It's just, it doesn't do anything. And again, and it perpetuates this idea that like, oh yeah, we'll just call him fat and that will do anything. It's like, it's dumb.
It doesn't do shit.
Like pointless.
It was also the funniest thing.
It makes Daria laugh, but aside from that,
oh yeah, I think it's the only funny thing. But anyway, she's 80 years old. Just want to throw that out here. That kind of blew my mind. Anyway, we need younger people in office. That was my point. Yeah, 80. Yeah, she. I think she spoke with E.T. and the dinosaurs. So anyway, yeah. So did our president and Bernie, to be fair. But anyway, so I want
Bruno
to
was
take.
organizing the Velociraptors.
That's why they're so smart. Anyway, let's take a quick break. We've been going on for way longer than I thought, and I wanted to give you guys time to freshen up, maybe use the bathroom, grab some water, whatever it may be, grab a snack. So we're going to go on a break, and we'll be right back. And people watching on YouTube, exclamation mark YouTube in chat for the link to my YouTube channel. Anyway, to get back in the discussion, we got a little sidetracked. I blame myself for bringing up Nancy Pelosi's age randomly. So sorry for sidetracking us just a tiny bit.
Ageist.
But I know, I'm an ageist. Not really, but sort of. It's okay. We'll talk about that later. Maybe that could be a whole podcast, ageism. Anyway, just to rein us in here. Was anyone ready to say something and I cut them off before the break? Zara, okay, go for it.
I wasn't going to say something before the break, but during the break, I looked at the Convention of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women.
Whoa.
Their
What is
general
that?
recommendation number 19.
Wait, what is this?
And-
What is this? What is this?
So this is an international human rights convention, but within that they have kind of another definition of violence, gender-based violence.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to.
I want to touch upon that, so it's fantastic that you going in that direction. Yeah.
Perfect. So I'm gonna read this. So gender-based violence, which impairs or nullifies the enjoyment by women of human rights and fundamental freedoms under general international law or under human rights conventions, is discrimination within the meaning of Article 1 of the Convention. These rights and freedoms include A, the right to life, B, the right not to be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. C, the right to equal protection according to humanitarian norms in time of international or internal armed conflict. D, the right to liberty and security of person. E, the right to equal protection under the law. F, the right to equality in the family. G, the right to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health. And H, the right to just and favorable work conditions of work. So I think that was a great example of different forms of violence. And I know it's specifically against women, but I think generally it could be applied to things like race.
So, yeah, I mean, if you guys don't mind, I kind of want to keep going off of what Zara was saying.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that because I kind of want to also go in the gender direction, because Zara earlier said, this is a kind of a retort to what Zara was saying about violence being a masculine thing, right? I see that as a tremendous problem. It's a plague. It's a problem that plagues women, I feel. Violence is not a masculine thing. Violence is a human thing. It's within all of our scope and power.
Zara's
I don't know.
like,
Sorry,
hold
Zara,
on.
go ahead. So maybe
Yeah,
I
I hear you
got
now.
you wrong. I got you wrong.
I was talking about physical violence specifically.
Mhm.
I would say, yeah, physical violence.
I would even disagree there, because I believe that as a human being, you have the power to defend yourself or to use violence, and you have that power. You should use it. And I don't think that women are excluded from that. I think women also have the power to fight and to. But I believe the problem is that women have been taught, especially in the West, that women have been. I kind of join Simone de Beauvoir on this, is that women have been taught to be subjugated and pacified, right? But so much so that the patriarchy has robbed them of their ability, their capacity to fight back using force at a very
On a
powerful.
side note, Beauvoir was very much a big fan of violence.
I know.
He said Mao was like the most moral man.
True, but I agree with her. It's like, why are women have to be these docile creatures that, anytime violence is evoked, it's like, that's testosterone. Like, no, like women are powerful too. They can fight and use their force as well.
Zara's been trying to hop in for a minute.
Sorry, Zara. I'm sorry.
So I have no. I have just two things to say about that. So when I said that, I made sure to say not men. I said masculine.
Isn't that gender? Like, why is it a gender issue? That's what I want to ask you.
Because I think you said that like they have the power, like having the power to be violent is different from tending towards violence, like having a tendency towards violence. Like if we look at the criminal justice system, which is like something I know more about than any other example I could give, is that women who are imprisoned are vast majority not in there for violent crimes. They're in there for non-violent crimes. Like physical violence. So I don't know. It's like, I mean, this could go into a totally different direction on whether people agree with this sort of thing. I don't know what anyone else thinks, but that's my view, is that there is a tendency to violence. And we could discuss whether that is a societal product or whether it's a product of nature.
I think we shouldn't make it about gender. It's a construct.
My issue with the gender thing is you could say the same thing about race. Like, well, just certain groups are they have more violence. You could say whether it's a social tendency, you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like, when you just put it on one, like, identity category, it kind of doesn't, I feel like, explain the social factors of violence. Although, I mean, Zara's right that, like, most violence is committed by young men. It's not actually
I mean, as much as, like, I agree with what Evan just said, but, like, at the same time, I mean, if you look at, like, a paper I wrote about sort of just, like, intimate partner violence statistics, and it's like, men are just way more likely to commit intimate partner violence than women are. Like, that's just a statistic in the US, and, like, again, you can blame that on the patriarchy, but, I mean, I'm just saying what Zara's saying is, like, statistically, I don't know, I see what Evan's saying too, but, like,
no, I'm coming at this from a different angle. I don't think you guys.
Yeah, I was about to say Daria was totally coming at this different from how Zara and Emma and Evan took this. But go ahead.
How did you mean it, Daria?
I'm saying that. So you guys are saying no, but men are, more. I don't know. I was saying more. What I was saying is, I think it's an immense problem that women are so pacified and subjugated and are taught to repel violence with any means necessary, like that, and then maybe going more to your guys' point, and that it's all put amongst men. It's all shoved onto men, right? Like that was more my angle. Is like women are like, why are women this and why is it a societal trend for women to be so mollified, to have lost that capacity as a mass, to have lost that capacity for why is it not like, because think about it, in the revolution,
I don't think it would be better if women committed more murders. Like, that wouldn't be a.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
It sounds like what you're saying, though, Dario.
That's a little extreme. No, that's way.
It sounds like you're saying let's use violence to empower women, kind of.
No, I'm saying why are men? Why do men feel more entitled to violence than women, for example? Okay. Like why? And I think that a lot of the issue is because we have, women are still immensely subjugated by force. We're forced, if it was balanced, if there was a balance of violence, right? That a capacity of violence, if there was a balance of it between men and women, I don't think things would be a lot different for sure. It's a problem for me.
What was that?
Huh?
This movie, it's called Born in Flames. It's from the 70s, and it's about feminist, anarchist power movements, and you should watch it. It's just, I mean, for examples of women taking on violent.
At the end of the movie, they do 9/11.
Let me give you an example.
No, I'm serious. I think you should watch it.
Well, let me give you an example. I will watch it because that sounds really interesting.
There is, he's down.
But I like more the idea of, like, I look at other societies, right? And For example, the Kurds. The Kurds are a fantastic example of this, right? Just if you looked at their right, there was a moment in America where they love to highlight the Kurds, right? Oh, look, they're fighting they're fighting against ISIS and all this stuff, right? But a thing that was really brought up in the news a lot too was, oh, look how there is like a non-gender. I mean, that wasn't completely true. I gotta tell you, because the command, I don't think there was I think there might have been some hierarchical things in place, but it did seem like for the most part, like the Kurdish military, for example, that was fighting ISIS, like the men and the women are, they fight as equals. There's no within minority groups in countries that haven't had the luxury of like an immense population, right? The men and the women would tend to work together, right, towards a certain goal. And I see potential in that, in regards to violence, right? Like I think I'd like to live in a society where, I'm as scared as physically force wise. I'm as scared as a woman than I am as a man.
I'm lost, Daria. I'm so lost. I don't know why you would want to be scared at all.
No, I'm saying, yeah, true, but I'm saying ideally for now, our next step, I think.
Is that the next step?
My point in bringing up Born in Flames.
I just don't like this image of women that are so helpless. It's like
I get what you're saying. Yeah,
it's a huge problem. There should be women are not helpless.
The Amazonas one.
Yeah, the Amazon.
But part of my point in bringing up Born in Flames was actually that women are capable. It's just maybe that you're not prone. First reaction is not I'm going to resort to violence. That doesn't mean I won't. It's just I think if anything, it's a level of I'm trying to say that women are very capable, and I don't think that. I don't know. I just think that because it's not your first reaction doesn't mean you're not capable of doing it.
What you're saying.
One at a time.
If you don't mind me chiming in on this, what you're saying, Emma, is you're from what I gather from that is you're implying a difference of temperament between general numbers of men and the general population of women. If you took an average of both, because you're saying the reaction that they're prone to, the proclivity that they're the way that they present themselves, or not. I'm not saying all women. There are obviously very badass women and more than anyone knows. But it's isn't that what you're implying? There's a bit of a temperamental difference in reaction and behavior, generally speaking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would probably make that implication right now, but I'm not saying that that's not societally induced. Mm-hmm. But I was just trying to make the point that I don't think that it's that it's not there's this total just women are completely mollified, as I was saying. I think it's just maybe
in many ways.
So I say the huge problem that's because we made violence a gender thing or a masculinity, or we attach these labels and terms to it that shouldn't have been associated with it in the first place. We went too far in compartmentalizing it.
Are guns not gender neutral?
I hear a lot of Beth for a shotgun.
No, but actually, that was not a. That's not a.
Oh, was it a joke?
That was not a joke. How do you make a gun more gender neutral? Obviously skulls and whatever and flames gender it, but just a gun by itself, is that not gender neutral?
Wait, what do you mean? In symbolism or just a pure object?
Not both. Either. Because I've heard a lot of okay, well, guns are phallic. I've heard that.
Yeah. Any
so
elongated.
How do you make a gun? But how do you make a gun gender neutral? That's I guess my question. And are guns gender neutral in your opinion?
I have a question.
Okay.
So granted that there are, let's say, two kind of broad social stereotypes of how, or socialization processes of how men are more likely to react with violence and women are more likely to be passive because of how some mostly social factors. I don't think testosterone or whatever biology plays no role either. But what would be from a kind of ethical standpoint? How does Daria, because he brought it up, anyone else? How should people navigate that? Should people gravitate more towards like more assertion, more violence, more passivity? Should it be like dependent on the situation? Should it be in the service of some kind of ideal? How should people modify those reactions?
Well, sorry, I don't know who wants to go first. I talk a lot.
Go for it, Dario, if you want to.
No, I mean, first, our first job, I guess, would be from a cultural standpoint, like strip the symbolisms. That would be the most pacifist way. Strip the symbolism of gender associated with violence. So doesn't necessitate any more use of violence or any less use of violence. Just strip those symbols from it. You know, I don't want no skull and bones and men this and masculinity that. You know, like fuck that. You know, and then that would be our first job. And then I really think our second job in the grand scheme, right? I think that like the narratives that are like dismantling the narratives, I guess, right? Because the narratives that are attached to violence, to masculinity, like always putting these like putting the statistics that like, you know, which are, you know, they're factual, right? I guess they're like, you know, men are more, you know, men commit more violent crimes like this and more violent crimes, you know, but the way that we juggle those statistics and facts, it really sounds like they're reinforcing the narrative that violence is a monopoly of masculinity. So that needs to go too. That just needs, all that needs to, like, and then for third part, yeah, I'd really say, Evan, it is a contextual thing, because I'm not here saying we should just go burn everything down. It'd just be so pointless, you know. Though knowing when to learning how to use violence and what context it's appropriate in, easier said than done, of course. But yeah, it's totally dependent. You can't just use violence all the time. Like, you know, I'm not. If a representative comes and it doesn't work, I'm not saying, you know, hang them. No, I'm just saying, like, after 400 years, we're like, okay, you know, it's not working. You know, it's not working. That was.
But you're saying like there should be no gender difference in like men and women's reactions as far as active or passive, violent or peaceful, etc. Like they should have the same kind of degree of response in the situation.
I mean, should is difficult. Should is a hard word. Yeah, right. I mean,
that implies judgment when you say should.
That implies judgment. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the question, because I'm not just like describing saying like, well, okay, granted that that's true. Should it be that, you know, men, we need to like socialize men to be less violent? Do we need to socialize women to be more assertive? Do we need to do both? Neither? Something contextual? That's the question.
Actually, I have somewhat of an opinion on this. So, I'm a fan of, like, you know all those graphs that circulate that, or even memes to some extent, that depict equality versus justice versus equity, like all that. So I think a little bit of both needs to be done, from what you're talking about, Evan. So what I believe in from an equity standpoint is like you swing the scales a little more in the opposite direction so that it levels out. And to be more specific, I think that we could, you know, have programs that reinforce, like, you know, okay, no need to be so violent among males, and empowering, you know, women, and when you tip the scale sort of in the opposite direction, the idea is that, ultimately the goal is that there is no difference between how, you know, a man or a woman reacts to a given situation, with the example being violence.
But that's predicated upon the presupposition that human beings are infinitely malleable, and you can use a neuroplasticity argument or an epigenetical argument. They try to do this in Scandinavia, which is an interesting thing. They the equity thing where they made it mandatory to hire 50-50 men and 50-50 women for like chemist positions and some of the more scalable jobs over there which were more overrepresented in men, and the differences got larger.
Yeah.
The differences didn't get bigger between the sexes because the biological difference, which of course gender has a social constructivist element. I'm not denying that. I'd be a fool. But it's interesting to hear equity arguments because when they're actually enacted in a society. And Scandinavia is an unbelievably egalitarian society compared to many, and the differences, the numbers got larger. They elected to do different things based on what I would assume to be temperament, socially constructed and biological, more or less. I don't know.
So to that point, Oscar, I would say that maybe the goal is not to have the exact same reaction from men and women, let's say, but to just take the social implications out of it. And I see one way of doing that through equity. So maybe the end goal is not that the reactions from men and women become the same across the board. Maybe there are, as you say, perhaps there are biological differences, maybe. But that we take away any other biases so that it's as like controlled as possible, I guess. And we take away any social implications by not gendering violence, as Daria says. So I could see that side.
Right.
Zara, you have a smug look on your face.
Like for me, like, I don't know. Putting these labels, I agree that we shouldn't necessarily be gendering them. But to me, like, something that's masculine, I am not saying that is a man thing. I'm like...
You're going to have to elaborate for my monkey brain.
There are like feminine things that like feminine attributes that men can have and masculine attributes that women can have, and I don't think that we should say that all men are masculine and all women are feminine.
Understood.
But I think it is
so isn't compartmentalizing that in the first place a problem? The masculine, feminine, just being like, it's more feminine to like have tea time, like
No, but I think that like for any social way of looking at things, for example, if you look at individualism versus collectivism, those are labels that we can technically put on different societies generally to be, say, more maybe more Eastern cultures are more collectivist and more Western cultures are individualist. And I don't know, I think those, they're not like, I don't think either of them are negative. It's like just two kind of polar opposites that we can kind of create a like,
that model for me doesn't work. Evan, you're a philosophy major. I don't like binary opposition. I think it's a really pathetic model.
I'm not saying that it should be binary. I'm saying that it's like you can be everywhere in between.
But the poles are not even true. Those are
my hot take is there's no such thing as individualism.
Oof.
Like it's a contradictory idea. I mean, if you're like, oh, I'm just an individual, why do you need it? You don't have an ideology that's like, it's not a coherent thing. It's just, I'm just going to reject anything, any external group tells me.
Well, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people, right? I mean,
people don't have ideas. Ideas have people.
I kind of like that. That's kind of cool.
I've never heard that.
That's kind of like everybody has a narrative or a belief system which regulates their serotonergic system and their outward personality, and a lot of their projections on other people. So I mean, like, to a degree, we are very much brainwashed. I mean that's obvious, but it's just kind of funny when I think I read that somewhere. Some philosopher said that, So
I'm gonna look.
That's what I would. Yeah, I don't know, Zara. What Zara was saying. I'd like you to continue, Zara, because I accept what Oscar said is exactly how I feel like the route you're going down is like that. Just putting those two pillars of, let's take it back to masculine and femininity. Like for me, that's like, that's already that right there. That axiom is the problem. Like fuck that.
I think the problem is like the negative and positive aspects, like and judgments that we put on those. I don't think it's the things themselves. Like,
Can you
it's a
have
way of
it? Can you have one
communicating.
without the other?
I mean, I think so.
Like, can you have masculinity and femininity without like stereotypes and negative and positive? Right. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that's a cultural question. I'd
That's
say so.
tough. I'd say it's tough. Like, I don't see it happening in my lifetime.
It's weird.
What
I
I
feel
think
like
what
you're a
Zara's
person.
pointing out is that something to like push for. I mean, that it's something that we should like.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the point, yeah, is that when she's making those qualifications, she's not putting a judgment on it, sort of. Like, she's saying this is something that she associates with, like, it's even, like, I mean, a good example is if you think of, like, trans masc or, like, trans femme people, where it's, like, I mean, it's sort of, that's not, like, I mean, it's sort of, like, embodying traits that you want to embody, but it's not necessarily, like, again, it's not, like, a judgment. It's just, like, okay, this is, like, how I want to present, or this is, it becomes more difficult when you put it on, like, object, or when you say like that's masculine or that's feminine, something that's like non-identity, I think, but I don't know. Anyway.
No, that's great.
And I kind of mean it more in a way of like, again, going back to the representation argument. You know, not having those polls and those, you know, labels sometimes is so, you know, it's hard to get representation when you don't have kind of those polls, and you can say that you're in between, but like, you know, I think
a reference point. Are you
Yeah.
talking about reference? Oh, I see what you're getting at. If we can't talk about it,
Yeah,
how do we
Daria, like
Exactly.
I feel the way you feel, where I'm not a fan of labels in general, but they're like a necessary evil in my view. Because you can't organize ideas and thoughts without labels, in my opinion. Like,
That's
you
true.
can't like, let's say you can on a podcast, okay. You can in a discussion, but if it comes down to
how would you go on a diet without labels?
No, sure, exactly.
Yeah,
Sure.
But I would say then, no, it's a great question. I would say then, because I, like, for better or for worse, I mean, we all do, right? We resort to these labels to talk about things like violence, right? But I would go so far as to say that there, you know, one way of doing it is like changing the label completely, which is not very practical because we're already used, right? But the other way is maybe changing our notions of what like masculinity and femininity is, like, instead of, and the first thing we did, I think our generation is getting better at that, is like, we're not attaching to man and woman, right? Like, you can be masculine as a woman, you can be feminine. That was a great initial, like, you know, crack in the, but then changing the meaning of masculine, feminine, and as to like even going so far as changing the definition in the dictionary, I think would be a really good the way people use it would be more interesting, like, right, like if it wasn't even brought up in a cultural context, I think that would be healthier. For example, like if it would never even crossed our mind to say like I don't know, like liking textiles is like a feminine thing. If it never even crossed our mind to say that, I think that'd be pretty cool. If that label was used in not in that context ever, if it couldn't ever be associated with the context.
Guys, I hate to interrupt, but my phone's on 1%, and the charging port is what I use for the headphones.
Yeah, the lightning port. Actually,
no.
I was going to
First world
suggest. No, it's all good. I was going to suggest that this be a good ending point anyway.
Okay.
So I think your phone was like a nice timer for us. We had a great talk today. We had a great discussion. And we could even have a part 2 of Is Violence the Answer? Because I think there's plenty that's left unsaid that maybe we aren't going to get the chance to talk about today. I wanted to give a chance for anyone to give any last thoughts that they had to close us off before we sign off for the day. Okay.
I have one.
Yeah, go.
People might not like this because you guys went to a French school, and the French were really into the French were really into postmodernism, which is, well, one of the beliefs in postmodernism is that your group identity is paramount and that all just avatars and mouthpieces for our subconscious power interest, which is a tempting point to take. I'm not going to dispute the sort of epistemological structure of an ideation of how that came to be as a philosophy, but I think that I'm seeing a lot of this reversing of group identity being paramount, and I don't think it helps any oppressed minorities who've had, or any oppressed people, or individuals, and you know, and I see that a lot, and I think it's an interesting thing because you know, like in universities and colleges and in intellectual places where people, you know, are kind of like yourselves, well-read, you know, interested, open people. I see this as a recurring mantra, and it scares the hell out of me because it's the same philosophy. It allows racism to gain more power through an unexpected avenue. And that's the thing. It allows stereotypes to be reversed, and therefore, you know, you could argue the likeliness of this to happen, whether it's likely or not. But I see this a lot, like group identity. It's a quota of group identity. And people are saying, like, even for the Black community, like the Black community, it's actually, they're not a community because they don't have homogenous views and they don't have common goals necessarily. They're not monolithic. So it's actually a racist statement. I would argue, could be fallible. I am fallible in many of my arguments, but I think that it's a fallacy because the technical fact that they're not a community, and other people, although they may be alike in some ways, they're still individuals. And I'd like for conversations and conversations such as this, and which is a great one in my opinion, that we've been having. I'd like for conversations not only to be more open, but to prioritize group identity much less, because it's important, but I don't think it's most important. It destroys civilizations. It's proven to be a you know,
it's alienating.
All the atrocities. Well, Leninism, Stalinism, class-based guilt, that goes to gender-based guilt, which is some of the things that are going around, or race-based guilt, or these baited sort of trigger words which are used in rhetoric from, I hate to go political, but both sides, because you can't, you know, and I don't see it as anything but counterproductive to the nth degree, you know. So that's what I'd like to say.
Ask you something about, why do you mean group identity as in like I'm a woman, identify as a woman, like all women, or do you mean like a collective that believes in a sort of collective ideology or collective vision of the future or whatever? Or do you have like, are they the same for you? Like group identity means both, or?
Okay, so that's an important distinction to make. I mean group identity as like gender, ethnic background.
I think his phone just died.
No. Well, I guess that's a good place to start next time.
Cliffhanger. All right, perfect. Well, you're going to have to tune in next time to hear Oscar's full answer. We're on Mondays at Mondays at 10:30 a.m. I'm open to changing the time. I'm also open to doing multiple podcasts a week, depending on how talkative we feel as a group. But sorry you didn't get to finish your sentence, Oscar. I'm sure that you'll be able to tune in next time and finish that thought. Thanks, everybody, for being on. Emma, Evan, Daria, Zara, Oscar. It was a great conversation. I think we will have a part 2. I would love to have all of you back on and then some, hopefully some new faces as well. Look out for the YouTube video of this. I'll send it to you guys. I haven't been doing a good job of actually sending you them. But thanks for being on, everyone. And I hope everyone who watched and everyone on the stream has a great day. Bye-bye now.